Bust the union busters.
Bust the union busters.
Stop imperialist wars abroad.
Stop imperialist wars abroad.
I want to welcome you today to this rally we're having, this protest against U.S. wars abroad in Ukraine and around the world, and against the NATO and the role of NATO. This rally has been initiated by the United Front Committee for a Labor Party, which is doing it in conjunction with the Si Cobas, an Italian union of logistic workers in Italy, which today is having a strike, a national strike of logistic workers against the war in Ukraine. And what the union is calling for is for the abolishment of NATO. They're saying U.S. should get out of Europe. The United States should get out of Europe. So workers are in struggle in Italy, and they face a massive crisis of energy costs. Workers are freezing, and millions of workers are losing their lives, are losing their homes and their housing. So the key question is, what is the American working class going to do? And we're here today to say that we need to organize in the unions for workers' strikes, that the ILWU and other unions had a strike in 2008 against the war in Iraq, and we need similar actions. And the union bureaucracy in this country, the AFL-CIO, are supporting the war. They also supported the Democrats who just voted to pass a law that prevents railroad workers from striking and prevents them from getting sick pay. So we know that the Democratic Party, which our unions support, is actually union busting and supporting an imperialist war. They're hungry, they're homeless people right here in San Francisco, and people are dying in the street because of lack of health care, and yet the government is spending $60 billion for the Iranian war. Where is our money going? Where is our resources? Why? Because the imperialists make money from war. Lockheed Martin and the war industry make money from killing people. They make money from bombs, but they don't have people. They don't have money for the working people of this country, for housing, for health care. There's also a struggle going on today of 48,000 UC workers who are fighting for a living wage. Many of these UC workers can't even afford housing. They don't have a living wage, and they're being fought by the UC management, who are union busters. The head of the labor relations work for Jackson Brown. She's a union buster. The regents are Democrats, and Gavin Newsom and the Democratic Party are in charge of UC. And if they said one word to support the strikers, hell no. So here we have a struggle against the war that is really being combined with the struggle of the railroad workers, the struggle of other workers against really a capitalist assault on the working class here in this country and around the world. So this is a United Front demonstration. There's one also that is going to be held in Boston against the war. And we say that we have to unite the left, we have to unite unions against this war, and we have to demand that all U.S. military bases be shut down around the world. We have to demand that NATO be abolished. NATO is about war. A war against the Iraqis, war against the Syrians, war against the people around the world, and it has to be abolished. So I want to thank you for joining us today. Our first speaker is going to be Ricardo Ortiz, who's a labor activist, and he's a Puerto Rican activist.
Well, here we are protesting the war that the United States and NATO provoked against Russia and using the Ukraine as a colony. The Ukrainian people have been exploited by United States and European investments since 1993. At that time, the United States imposed a complete economic receivership of the Ukraine. They appointed this United States Department of the Treasury, a person that also directed a task force of the IMF, the Agency for International Development, and her name was Natalie Jaresko, the chief economist of the United States Embassy in Kiev. And they start privatizing the whole Ukrainian economy after the fall of the Soviet Union. So they made Ukraine to borrow loans from the IMF, and this got to the peak that at one point they made Ukraine get loans and get privatized a lot of their economy for the European and American investments. This culminated with the coup that the Americans instigated in 2014. And one of the conditions that the United States imposed was to have this American citizen, this official Natalie Yaresko from Chicago, as the Minister of the Treasury of the Republic of the Ukraine. And what did this person do? She continued the process of privatization for the United States and the European Bank of Reconstruction. So the United States and the European Union has its evil hands in Ukraine since 1992 to the point that it's a financial colony of the Ukraine. Later, this very same person, Yaresko, was appointed by none other than President Obama to be the executive director of the Fiscal Control Board that administered the colony of Puerto Rico until 2021. The aspect that a lot of people also forget is that the Putin regime also had interest in Ukraine. It had mines in the Donbass, and the German imperialists and the Americans forced these mines to close. So, because they didn't want any Russian influence in the area, and they want to rule Ukraine for themselves. So, they created and provoked this war. But let me make one thing clear. The government of Russia is a capitalist government, and it has imperialist ambitions. So that doesn't mean that we give any support for the oligarch-backed pro-capitalist regime in Russia. We tell the soldiers of all sides, turn your guns around and fight the capitalist class of Europe, the United States, and the crackpot capitalist regime of Russia. So, one more thing before I finish. The Democratic Party, the longest running capitalist party in the world, is the one that is ruling this country right now. And what are they doing? They're sending weapons. They're sending intelligence operatives to the Ukraine, wasting money that we need for medical research, for medical needs, for housing, for school. They are giving that to the military-industrial complex. And what the so-called socialist legislators in Congress have done, that Ocasio-Cortez is a fraud because she's a social democrat. And since 1919, the social democrats have always backed war. So what did she do? She voted for the war in Ukraine. What the other hero of some people, Bernie Sanders, what he has done, support the war, as well as he supported the bombing of Yugoslavia in the 90s, as well as he supported the 51-day blockade of Gaza. Down with the Democrats. The Democrats is the Democratic Party is an imperialist party. I'm going to end with this. We have one party in this country, and its name is capitalism, and has two wings. One liberal wing called the Democrats, and the conservative wing is the Republicans. Down with capitalism. Down with the Democratic Party. Down with the labor bureaucrats, traitors. For a war without frontiers. For a workers' revolution. Here and throughout the world. Thank you.
This rally is being held in conjunction with our brothers and sisters in Italy who are striking. There's a strike of the Si Cobas logistic workers against the war, the imperialist war, against NATO and against U.S. being in Europe. And I just returned from Japan. And what I found there is the United States has bases all over Japan, including near Mount Fuji. U.S. jets and helicopters are flying all over Japan. And Okinawa is being used as a base to attack China. And that's another issue that we're fighting. This war in the Ukraine is not just about fighting Russia, but it's also about fighting China and the Asian pivot. So our next speaker is Katie. She's from United Against War and Militarism. Welcome, Katie.
My name is Katie. I organize with United Against War and Militarism. Steve was talking a little bit about the UC worker strike happening across the state, across all 10 UC campuses. They just finished up their third week on strike, and that's 48,000 workers all across the state that have been withholding their labor. I think the UC tries to paint itself under a rose-colored lens and talk about how it's all enthusiastic about innovation and progressivism, but if you look at the day-to-day lives of the students and workers who are doing most of the teaching and research across the UC system, people are really struggling. Even those who are supposed to be teaching at the #1 public university in the world are struggling to pay for food and rent, and 1 in 10 students across the UC system is homeless at some point in their time as a student, which is pretty horrible. People are seeing their paychecks eaten up by inflation day by day, and the cause of this inflation is not only the U.S. government printing money hand over fist trying to rescue its waning economy, but also the blatant corruption and inefficiency that's associated with monopolies that run the whole global and national supply chains. For instance, the railway system in the U.S., which is owned by just a small handful of companies who control all of the railroads in America. We saw this week that the workers who keep these arteries of economy and commerce flowing every single day, tirelessly, day in, day out, were just told point blank by the top elected officials in our country that they have no more legal right to go on strike to demand something as basic and minimal as a few days of sick leave per year to stay with their families when they're not feeling well. This is unacceptable. And if we're letting this serve as a precedent for the future of the labor movement, that the government can simply tell people at their own whim when they can or cannot exercise certain legal rights to withhold their labor, then we're in a pretty poor condition moving forward. The liberal news media is all a flurry with all of these dramatic statements about the potential impact of a railroad worker strike on the economy, saying that it would cost $2 billion per year to the U.S. economy if these workers were to go on strike, which might sound like a lot, but we could put that number into perspective by considering that in less than a year, the same elected officials who struck down the railway workers strike also voted on a bipartisan basis to send almost $100 billion to fund the war in Ukraine. Almost all of which is just going to military aid, to weapons that are used to kill people that most American citizens have never seen or met before and don't understand why this war is even happening. So when we put into perspective the hysteria around shutting down the railroads to the cost of $2 billion per year with the $100 billion that our entire U.S. Congress just handed over to military contractors, it's pretty clear whose interests are really at heart amongst the federal politicians in this country. And I think that we can see by looking at all of these different connections in the economy how one struggle, even something as close to home as the strike happening at UC Berkeley right now, is tied directly to things that might seem really remote, like the war in Ukraine. But when the struggle gets hard and when it's tempting to just put our heads down and focus on the issues that are immediately in front of us, we have to resist that urge, because ultimately we are only going to win if we're able to unite with other fights, not only across the nation but across the world, in opposition to the elites, to the politicians, to the corporate bosses who are keeping us under their thumbs and exploiting us every single day. Thanks everybody for coming up.
This rally against imperialist war against U.S. military around the world and also against NATO is taking place the day after the sellout of the railroad workers. And the railroad workers, I mean, imagine that in the United States, this capitalist government, the Democrats talk about they're for sick pay, but then they vote for a bill that prevents railroad workers from getting sick pay. These people are sick. They're sick with capitalism. They're sick with supporting the bosses. That's what they're sick with. They belong in jail because they're war criminals. Not only are they screwing the workers in the United States, but they're attacking and murdering workers all over the world. The AFL-CIO is supporting that. They take $75 million a year from the National Endowment for Democracy. The AFL-CIO was also involved in overthrowing the government of Allende and the government of other governments. They tried to overthrow the Venezuelan government to bring back U.S. control of these economies. So our next speaker is Jack Heyman, who's a longtime trade unionist in the ILWU, has fought for internationalism and fought for workers and unions to take action against imperialist war. Welcome, Jack.
We could have 1,000 people out here today, but the bourgeois media, the mainstream media, tells lies after lie after lie, and unfortunately, many of the people that have been in the traditional anti-war movement during the Iraq War, Afghanistan War, aren't here today. The real power lies in the working class. Right now, the most important struggle, historical struggle before us, is the railroad workers. Workers around the country are feeling a strike fever. We see it on the UC campuses. 48,000 out on strike. That's historic. Over 100,000 railroad workers on the cusp of making a decision to adhere to the dictates of the government of the United States that they have to go back to work, or to refute that and stay out of work. If the railroad workers go out, and longshore workers who work in the ports across this country go out with them, we'd have a general strike on our hands. That's what's needed. We don't need wars like this war in the Ukraine. What we need is class war. That's what we need right now. We need a leadership. You don't have that leadership, not in the AFL-CIO or in any of the major unions right now. We have to build that class struggle leadership. Now, this whole war didn't start this year. The war actually started with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. There was an agreement made in 1991 that NATO would not move farther east towards the Russian border. The U.S. has broken that time and again. We need to abolish NATO. NATO is a military alliance aimed at Russia. Russia's not even communist. They're not a worker state anymore. But still, it's about expanding the empire. And so, the last ambassador from the U.S. to the Soviet Union said, NATO must not move farther east. That's a red line for the Russians. Chaz Freeman, who was head of he was the director of national intelligence, a lifelong diplomat. Chaz Freeman had said, don't move farther east, that's a red line for the Russians. And that famous war criminal, Henry Kissinger, who should be in jail, he even said, that's a red line for the Russians if you move NATO farther east. What more do you need? Even the Pope came out and said this is a provocation. Jesus Christ. I'm surprised that Russia early on didn't actually send troops into the Ukraine. It's been provoked for a long time now, and I'm sure that the Russians aren't going to give back what they gave to the Ukraine 100 years ago, the Donbass. Crimea was given to them during the Khrushchev period because the Ukraine was part of the former Soviet Union, and no one expected the Ukraine to turn against Russia. But that's what's happened. And in a situation like this, if NATO and the U.S. prevail, it'll be bad times for the working class internationally. The European Dock Workers Council has taken a position against the war. We in the ILWU are also talking about an action to refuse to load military cargo to the Ukraine. If that happens, that could bring an end to the U.S. support for the Ukraine government. The Ukraine government is saturated with fascists. That's right, Nazis who hold up Stefan Bandera, the Ukrainian Nazi leader, as their hero. They got statues of him in Kiev. So if on the morrow the Russians prevail militarily in the Ukraine, that would be an advance for the working class internationally. I say no to war, yes to class struggle and class war. I did forget to mention one thing. We need a political alternative in this country. It's been said before, the Democrats and the Republicans both represent capitalism. We have no party to represent the working class. We need a workers' party. In all my years in maritime, 40 years, I always ran on a program to break with the Democrats to build a labor or workers' party in this country. That's what the crying need is for now. We need our own party that could end these imperialist wars and foment international workers' revolution. Thank you.
We have a long struggle in this country to get the unions and the labor movement organized, and the left, because the left is not organizing against this war, and they should be. It's not benefiting the working class. It's an attack on the working class. Every penny that's spent on the wars abroad is used to attack the workers here, coming out of social services, healthcare, and education. Our next speaker is Alex. He's with the Party of Communists. So welcome, Alex. He's a member of it. So Charles Rackless is here, and Charles is going to make a presentation. Welcome, Charles.
Well, this is Charles Rackless. I'm here to speak on behalf of the International Leninist Trotskyist Tendency and the Communist Workers Group. We join this action against imperialist wars here today, and we say to the U.S. working class, launch a class war against the main enemy at home. Not one penny for the Defense Department. Abolish NATO. Hot cargo, all imperialist belligerent freight for workers' control of logistics and distribution. We say build a soldiers come home now movement that shuts down foreign U.S. bases. Across the U.S., Europe, and Russia, we need general strikes and mass labor-led actions to defeat the imperialist war machines. From the People's Forum to the GOP Congressional Caucus, the so-called anti-war movement is calling for negotiations as a pressure campaign on Biden, Zelensky, and Putin. Negotiations between imperialist powers can never end the inter-imperialist conflict. They only unite the belligerent capitalists in denying the working class power and kicking the can down the road to the next hotspot. Taiwan, perhaps. We say, workers of the world unite, a working class anti-imperialist united front that strikes together and march separately with full right of criticism. Imperialism is a system, not a choice of national capitals. The terminal crisis of capitalism offers imperialism no path to peace. The U.S. NATO bloc's strategic orientation to encircle Russia and China and to use Ukraine as a proxy accelerated since the Euromaidan. And the competing Russia-China imperialist bloc knows it must secure its near periphery to advance as a global power. Thus, the war in Ukraine is an inter-imperialist proxy war between the decaying hegemonic U.S.-NATO bloc and the China-Russia bloc for control of the semi-colonial world, markets, and spheres of dependency. Because the war is reactionary on both sides, workers and soldiers must take a dual defeatist attitude towards the war. What does the slogan, "the main enemy is at home," mean? Does it mean that workers have no other enemies than their national capitalist class? No. Karl Liebknecht appealed to the workers during the first inter-imperialist war with the slogan, "Our main enemy is at home." Today, campists, social patriots, and centrists hide the last phrase of his statement, which was, "We must wage this political struggle alongside the proletariat of other countries as they struggle against their own imperialists." What blocks the working class from initiating class struggle against imperialism? The biggest obstacle is the labor bureaucracy. It acts as a transmission belt, delivering the Democratic Party's wing of the ruling class's objectives and ideology to the rank and file. They tell workers, you are middle class, and your interests align with capitalism and imperialism, so you must fund the war in Ukraine. Their main role is to block the working class from becoming self-conscious and launching its own fighting workers' labor party to struggle for a workers' government. In addition, nominal socialists who deny the inter-imperialist character of the proxy war and who do not call for dual defeatism fail to explain why the workers need to break with their own national capitalist class. Ultimately, they fall in line as social patriots for one camp or the other. The working class needs a bridge from its current consciousness to the organizational independence needed to defeat imperialism. To build that bridge, working class anti-imperialists need to convene a new anti-war Zimmerwald conference. The struggle for a new Zimmerwald can launch a new revolutionary workers' international that unites workers against imperialist powers. That is what the main enemy is at home requires. To Russia, we say, no annexations. Bring the troops home now. Free the anti-war prisoners and protesters and drop all the charges. To the Russian workers, we say, down with the capitalist state. Build workers' councils and take power as in 1917. Launch the socialist revolution. To the Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, we say, turn your guns around, arrest the officer corps. The fascists and capitalists are at the rear, goading you into this meat grinder of a war. Socialists stand for no annexations, for an independent Soviet Ukraine, for workers' Russia, for self-determination of Ukrainians and Russian-speaking minorities. To defend civilians, we say fraternize across the front. Turn the inter-imperialist war into socialist revolution that spreads across the borders.
Thank you, Charles. So I want to let everyone know that this struggle is going to continue against the imperialist war, against U.S. and against NATO. We are going to combine this struggle with the struggle of workers in this country who are fighting, and the caseworkers at UAW who have been on strike, the miners who've been on strike. Warrior Met. For over a year, these miners have been on strike, and our unions need to mobilize. Workers have to organize to support these struggles, and it has to be combined with this fight against the war.
Abolish NATO now. Our main enemy is at home.